Good afternoon from London and welcome to the Nest Center midweek briefing. I'm John Lough. Our discussion for today is the Kremlin's latest nuclear signaling, and we're delighted to have with us Pavel Baev. Pavel is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, where he's worked for over 20 years. He began his career in a Soviet Ministry of Defense Research Institute before moving to what was then the newly created Institute of Europe. He's the author of several books on security and foreign policy issues related to Russia. Welcome back, Pavel. It's very good to have you with us.
Very good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Well, Pavel, I think you'll agree that this conversation is, in a sense, quite well timed. And not all our viewers may be aware that yesterday there was a meeting of the Russian Security Council that began with a sort of bizarre tour de table by President Putin, who wanted to know from his security officials, in theory, he wanted to know how to respond to President Trump's statement on the 30th of October about his intention to restart nuclear testing in response to the activities of other countries. I think he then named China and Russia being among them. And this discussion that went around the table, of course, it was all scripted beforehand, and you had Defense Minister Belousov saying we must start testing immediately. The Chief of General Staff Gerasimov obediently repeating the same message. But then we got, I thought, to the really interesting part, because Sergei Narishkin, the head of foreign intelligence, said, well, we've had this telegram from the US ambassador, the Russian ambassador to the US, saying that he's contacted US officials and he can't really get a clear answer from them about what Trump actually has in mind. Well, of course, this is no particular surprise because the president's words were far, far from clear. And then Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, was also asked to take a position. And I thought he was extremely cautious by saying that we really don't know what's going on here and we need time to find out. So Putin then came to seemingly, no doubt, a prepared conclusion, which is that, dear colleagues, please send me your proposals about a potential response to the US starting nuclear testing. But please, in the meantime, find out what on earth is actually going on. So that's to kind of sort of set the context. But Pavel, I think we also have to keep in mind that Trump's remarks, it seems, were prompted, at least in part, by Russia's testing of this Burevestnik missile. And then the Poseidon underwater torpedo that Putin has boasted about its destructive potential. And from what I understand, the US certainly doesn't have something that is an equivalent. So there's quite a sort of complicated background story here. But if we start perhaps in the first place with the Burevestnik and the Poseidon, what do you think's going on here from the Russian perspective? Why, after a long interval, is the Kremlin returning, or has the Kremlin returned to this, if you like, sort of nuclear posturing?
Yes, it's not a question for which a definite answer can be produced. And for these two projects, the pause is indeed very long because Putin advertised them as ready for deployment back in March 2018. And during the first Trump administration, in fact. And they were obviously not ready for deployment. They were bad tests with dead scientists. And obviously the infrastructure for both projects is quite complicated. And each project has its own, so to say, set of obstacles and its own slow progress. But it cannot be a coincidence that both projects became ready at the same time, exactly in the late October. So it's one sort of interval between that announcement and this announcement. There is, however, a different pause, which I find even more interesting, that during nearly 9 months of this year, Putin really refrained from any nuclear brinksmanship, which through the course of the Ukraine war was his kind of trademark policy. He started it with a statement about the unprecedented damage that the West would suffer if it will help Ukraine. Several other occasions, there were not just discourse, there were some demonstrations, but since approximately March this year, nothing. And very clearly, the voices in Moscow which advocated for preventive nuclear strikes were suppressed and discouraged. And not just voices, it's not just the talk about the nuclear matters. There were very clearly several things which indicated Putin's restraint, including, for that matter, the Zapad strategic exercise, which were really smaller scales and low profile and with no particular kind of nuclear twist to them. There was very clear, very unusual, I would say, move when the newly created strategic nuclear submarine Knyaz Pozharsky, which Putin inaugurated in summer, went to join the Northern Fleet without testing its weapon system, without testing Bulava. There were exercises of strategic forces earlier last month, generally exactly on the pattern as it happens every October. Nothing larger than usual, exactly on the same mode. So there was, we can find more indications about Putin's self-restraint in this department, and it suddenly ended very abruptly with one announcement, another announcement, with kind of more noise around this, these two announcements of successful tests, about his promise of the devastating response if the Tomahawk missiles would be used against Russia. And now we have this meeting of the Security Council. So there is a sequence of moves in this domain, very quick sequence, so to say. Quite unusual.
Pavel, I agree with you there that this seems to have been very carefully prepared as a reaction to perhaps a particular scenario. And it seems to be certainly correct that there was this pause, if you like, from late last year. We had, of course, the launch of the testing of this Oreshnik missile,
yes,
which again Putin really sort of bigged up as something that could do immense damage to the Ukrainian government if they chose to, attack a bunker or something like that in Kiev. And it was really very strong messaging. And then when the Trump administration returned, there was clearly an effort to try to build up some relationship, and it seems to me that Putin had no interest in threatening at that point. But something definitely seems to have happened in the meantime, and whether it's really the Tomahawks, which personally I've always interpreted as just a bluff on the part of Trump. I don't think he had any intention of providing Ukraine with these missiles, and he almost sort of signaled as such afterwards it would take so long to train them and all the rest of it. But Moscow has chosen, it seems, to react quite harshly. And we have, again, related to this, effectively the breakdown of the negotiations of the US on any sort of peace deal in Ukraine. So there's this sudden escalation. And what is, do you think, the purpose of that? I mean, are they trying to intimidate Trump in a way that they think he'll return to the negotiating table and make concessions? Because he doesn't seem to be somebody who reacts in the same way as his predecessor. Joe Biden was very sensitive to these types of nuclear threats, being very much a product of the Cold War and a man with, of course, considerable expertise in the area of foreign affairs. So I'm trying to figure out for myself what is the goal of this posturing.
My reading is that the goal changed from one step to another, so to say. Because when there was a kind of first move on this chessboard with the announcement of the test of Burevestnik, I would make a reference, kind of small footnote here, that we don't have any confirmation that the test really happened. It's only Putin's words and Gerasimov's statement. We don't have any technical data which would indicate this. But okay, let's assume that nuclear-propelled cruise missile indeed was launched somewhere in the high north and stayed in the air for 14 hours without being detected, which is a bit of a stretch of strategic imagination. But okay, let's assume it happened. And I think the point in this message was very much about reminding Trump about that moment in the year 2018, and also reinforcing Putin's suggestion, so to say, to Trump to observe the limits of the New START treaty and in general to return to discussing these matters. I think Trump's decision to stop the negotiations with Putin so abruptly was a bit of a shock to Putin, and so that was a signal that there are more important matters to discuss between Russia and USA than just Ukrainian territorial concessions. Let's go for real substantive discussion on the strategic arsenals. And Trump's response to that was so indifferent and dismissive. Trump really said, I don't care about this missile. We have a submarine near Russian coast. Putin should rather think about ending the war in Ukraine. The tone of that response was such that Putin felt compelled to reinforce the message, so to say. And probably an additional point behind the second message was concern about meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, where Putin suddenly discovered that they're going to discuss Ukraine war without Russia being present at the table. They are going to see whether they can find a joint position on that behind his back, so to say. And so he immediately dispatched Mishustin to Beijing to figure out what was really new in this regard. But I think the message was very much a part of this worry, not only about the end of his dialogue with Trump, sudden abrupt, but about the new start of Trump's dialogue with Xi Jinping. So one thing came together with another. And Trump's response to that Poseidon test was again something Putin never expected, very different from the response on the first, so to say, message. Suddenly this idea about resuming nuclear testing. And it is indeed very difficult to figure out what is the content of this Trump's response. But as sometimes happens in politics, words matter. I think both Putin and Trump share this deep conviction that their words have this capacity, magical capacity, to transform reality. Trump is pronouncing, we restart nuclear testing immediately, and it happens. While if you look at it seriously, restarting nuclear testing in the United States will probably take a couple of years, including the question of funding, of preparation, the Nevada test site, with all the political complications around that. Testing nuclear weapons 100 miles from Las Vegas is not really an idea which is going to find a lot of political support in Nevada, I presume. Little as I know about US politics. So it is not something which can be done immediately, and in particular by the Pentagon, because Pentagon is not in charge of nuclear testing. So there is space for being confused. And I think Shoigu at that meeting of Security Councils spelled it in great detail that we have a range of statements from the administration, and from this statement, it's impossible to figure out what is really happening. We need to see what's about some deeds, not some words. And Bortnikov was on the same wavelengths as you have mentioned. But it's not that only this confusion. I think the fact of gathering the Security Council and making it public is another step in the same sequence. It's not an announcement of a test. It is the presentation of kind of Russian very serious attitude towards that and readiness to proceed along this way of nuclear testing if they're given the pretext for that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, words really do matter when it comes to these things. Probably the difference between Presidents Trump and Putin is that Trump is able to somehow withdraw words or move on and say something else if it contradicts entirely what he said before. But there seems to have been, quite a long silence here from the president, although I believe he did say yesterday, again in rather vague terms, that the US was going to resume testing. But in the case of Russia, you mentioned Nevada. I don't have detailed knowledge of this, but I imagine that because the US hasn't tested since the early 90s, that it would be, let's say, organizationally, this is going to take some time to prepare. Belousov said yesterday that Russia was prepared in the case of its test site in Novaya Zemlya to resume testing quickly. Do you think that really is the case, or is it another instance of the Ministry of Defense claiming it's ready and it's in fact not?
I think the nuclear test site of Novaya Zemlya is not really ready for serious testing. The tests that were sort of in the works there were much more related for what I'm able to get from open sources and from satellite photography to this possible tests of Burevestnik in particular on surface. You really need to go really deep in the tunnels to prepare for nuclear tests, and Novaya Zemlya test site again is not used since the year 1990 for what I remember. Engineering there is not easy. You need to bring in a lot of heavy equipment. You need really to bring in a lot of people there. And now is not the right time of the year to do all this, so to say. I think Belousov is, again, as very often we see in officials reporting to Putin, particularly in public settings, giving him picture much different from what is reality. What worries me in that is the propensity of the Russian engineers, of the Russian top brass, of accepting much higher risk than common sense dictates. And we saw that in quite a number of accidents involving various nuclear devices, submarines, the prototypes. Again, words here matter not only in camouflaging the reality, but in creating conditions in which suddenly we might face not as kind of threat to European security, but a disaster of local, maybe regional proportions in the high north, where the environment is very sensitive, where search and rescue are very complicated, and so on and so on. So I think that situation on Novaya Zemlya is, again, it's in many ways a place where it is easier to work than in Nevada, because you don't have Las Vegas next to that. But at the same time, the logistics there is hard. You need to move everything by sea, and you cannot do that during winter time. So I think it would probably take really to prepare a significant and serious nuclear test. It will take another year at least.
Well, that probably buys us some time. Pavel, we have a question here from Roland Freudenstein. I actually wanted to get to this topic. He says, he asks, how much of a restraining influence does President Xi have on Putin in terms of direct nuclear threats and possible nuclear use? As Roland says, after all, in 2023, the only topic where China seemed to be taken into account was around global fears about an escalation in and around Ukraine. And the issue, of course, that central issue was the question of nuclear weapons. I certainly remember that Chancellor Scholz traveled to Beijing, I think it was the end of 2022, and was very encouraged by the fact that he got a statement from the Chinese that said effectively, using a nuclear weapon or threatening to use a nuclear weapon is a bad thing. And it sort of became fashionable to believe that the Chinese had exerted some influence on Putin. Whether or not that was true, we can't know. But do you think that the Chinese might have some restraining influence here?
Well, they calculate their political moves very carefully, and certainly their ability to influence Putin's moves now probably is far stronger than it was in late 22, when indeed there were some discussions about that, particularly after that hidden but I think very real crisis related to the Russian groupings on the far side of River Dnipro, which was really threatened by Ukraine, and where suddenly there was all sort of signals about Russia preparing for possible use of nuclear weapons. Which later on, where some information was leaked about US intelligence assessments being kind of 50-50 chance, which is extremely high as far as nuclear weapons is concerned. And whether Xi Jinping really communicated to Putin his disapproval of this idea, impossible to confirm. But clearly China is far more cautious in all that nuclear posturing than Russia, and now even than Trump, because suddenly on the background of this two discourses, China looks very responsible, really not joining that fray, but continuing with its building up of own capabilities without generating a lot of noise, additional risks related to irresponsible statements. So I think in a way China kind of benefits from that nuclear quarrel, but at the same time, whether China is ready to signal to Putin that it's not a good idea, again, if such a signal was delivered in 22, which is probable.
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that I think Putin refrained for a while from playing the nuclear card. That did seem to go away. But I think you're right. I've just read opinions from other experts who seem to think that China really could gain from the US restarting nuclear testing, because it's probably keen to test its own capabilities in this area. And Trump has implied that in China, Russia, and the US are at the same level in terms of the number of nuclear warheads, which of course is far from true in the case of China. There's a sort of rough parity between the US and Russia, but certainly not with China.
Yes,
China is way behind.
And Trump's point that China in 5 years is going to catch up was really off target. It's with all the gradual build up of Chinese nuclear capabilities, which are not all of them strategic in the sense of intercontinental. Considerable part of Chinese nuclear arsenal, which is again estimated very roughly at 600 warheads, at least a half of that is non-strategic, is kind of intermediate range or non-assigned to anything. So Trump's point about, in one short message, Russian experts immediately picked up on that. Trump kind of showed that he is off target at least 3 times when speaking about nuclear tests from other states when speaking about the Chinese speed of build up of nuclear arsenal. And when he was speaking about Russia having fewer nuclear weapons than the United States, which is not quite the case, because as far as non-strategic nuclear warheads is concerned, Russia has an advantage. So in
Indeed.
total number, Russia is ahead, and Trump was again off target here. Russian experts were very quick to, good experts like Alexei Arbatov, for that matter, were very quick to point out that, well, it looks like Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. Which
okay,
is
Pavel, I'm not going to challenge that point. We have a couple of questions, one from Bob Otto, who asks, how seriously do the Russians take Trump's Golden Dome? And this is an important question when you think back to the 1980s and the reaction of the Soviet leadership to Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. And it really does look as though the Golden Dome is kind of Star Wars on steroids. What do you think the Russian view is of this project?
Well, certainly there is a good long-going strategic concern about that. And as far as kind of Russian strategic thinking is concerned, this is really a bad idea. This is a risk which needs to be preempted. And because the testing of these two weapon systems is designed to be a part of that preemption, as well as the development of other strategic weapons, including the avant-garde glide vehicle. But I think that in the Russian assessments, Trump's drive towards Golden Dome is assessed in a bit of a realistic terms, that in terms of investment and technology, it cannot be ready in the foreseeable future, which is now on the Russian horizons, not that far away, so to say. It's, the war shortens your strategic horizons. So it is not the question which is going to be a significant real material risk during this Trump's presidential terms. And then, again, new leader with new ideas, who knows? So there is a long-running worry, and I think Gorbachev was at the very beginning of that strategic concern, but I don't think it's kind of urgent and acute. It's in the context of this particular surge of nuclear posturing, it is kind of somewhere in the background.
Understood. We're starting to get to near the end of our time, so I just wanted to come to really, I suppose, the crunch question. And I came up against this in Washington in 2023, I guess it must have been, talking about whether the Russian side really would have been prepared, or would be prepared to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Because there were many people in the Biden administration who were deeply worried by Putin's threats. And I would say that psychological pressure most definitely worked. Now, what seems to be you can't discard completely is the possibility that the Russian leadership would use a nuclear weapon. What's your view? I mean, I was brought up in the school of thought sort of earlier, I suppose early in my career, when I worked together with some really very distinguished military specialists in a research institute, who taught me that the Soviet General Staff, and thinking back to those days, definitely did not want a war to go nuclear, because they saw that as meaning the destruction of the motherland. I'm not sure there is any reason to believe that the Russian General Staff's view has fundamentally changed. But we have a political leadership here that is prepared to do radical things, and the war in Ukraine is an example of that. Do you really think this is a leadership that could take such a radical step in the case of a nuclear weapon, or such an extreme step?
I don't really think that, as far as Russian military thinking is concerned, it is about that. And I think Gerasimov, in his background as a kind of real tank general, and in his new experience with fighting the war in Ukraine, fancies anything of the sort kind of for military reasons, but then it is a political decision, and so I think if suddenly a decision is taken on the crossing nuclear threshold, it will not be really tactical, not for changing the situation on the battleground, but something of a kind of more demonstrative, of a different kind, where immediate military goals are not there. The means which are really prepared for that are much more of a strategic kind, because the non-strategic warheads, while numerous, are still out of a lot of Russian military who are supposed to be skilled with using them are not. They're in storage since Gorbachev times, and there was one exercise last July where a kind of fake warhead was attempted to attach to Iskander missile. But you need to really go on with this sort of training for months and months in order to be sure that if the order is given, that it's executed, it works. And I think in the Russian military, it's only the strategic forces which have this sufficient training, but that's a weapon of a different kind.
Absolutely. I want to squeeze in just two quick questions, so let's be quick here. Alexander Goltz asks, why are Western official sources silent about the Burevestnik test?
I've looked carefully about Norwegian data, because again, if it happened in the Arctic, and there are intelligence gathering capabilities up north, which should have been able to confirm that, or at least to disprove that. Very little. I cannot really explain that. With Poseidon, it's a different story. It's underwater after all. But they generally, the improvement of capabilities for monitoring Russian activities there is a process which has been continuing for a number of years. And I think such a thing, such an event as a very long flight of the nuclear-propelled cruise missile should have been picked up. And I don't have confirmation of that, which doesn't necessarily mean that it never happened, but at least there is a significant doubt in my mind about whether the test was indeed as successful as Gerasimov reported.
So maybe the short answer to Sasha Goltz would be either it didn't happen, or if it did happen, Western countries maybe do not have a united view on it, or at least want to try to play it down, which is possible. And the last question comes from Matt London in Washington, who asks, could a step back by the US and Russia on nuclear testing be a relatively easy, face-saving part of a possible Ukraine settlement as negotiated by Trump? Well, I suppose the answer is maybe if we get to that point where the sides want to re-engage, that this can be part of a broader US-Russia framework that sets in some way the tone for a possible improvement in relations between Russia and a number of Western countries. But I don't think it's going to be enough on its own to resolve what is such a massively complicated issue as this war in Ukraine. That would be my answer.
Yes, and it was striking that the announcement about Burevestnik was a part of Gerasimov reporting to Putin, which was primarily about Ukraine. The reporting on the situation of the battlefield wasn't exactly accurate. It was really another stretch of strategic imagination. But the connection between one and another, I think, was very apparent. So I think that a progress in restarting negotiations about ceasefire in Ukraine and a possible peace deal might result in de-escalation of this posturing, which is very risky. Words matter, and both leaders are sort of becoming finding themselves in a situation where they're compelled to take the next step, and the step which Putin has taken yesterday with this meeting of Security Council and with the kind of announcement that we are ready to test. What would be Trump's reaction to that? It's difficult to say, but we are in a very risky spiral.
Yeah, most definitely. Pavel, unfortunately, we have to stop there because I think we could carry on for a good long while. Thank you so much for joining us today and enlightening us with your knowledge in this area. Been a really interesting discussion. I want to thank our audience for being with us and to remind everyone that we'll be back at the usual time next week. Same time, same place. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.